A typical web app on the server might try to access some data sources such as APIs and database queries before delivering the content to the browsers. Also, on the client side, the app can fetch data by accessing the APIs directly. To do so, Next.js recommends using fetch API as well as the cache function, fetch for making API calls and cache for keeping the obtained data in the memory during the request response pipeline. I try to demonstrate how we can utilize them in our apps, and I will cover two separate concepts of fetching data on the server and client as well as using the cache function from React. I also will show you some data fetching best practices like using Zod and SWR as well as performing parallel data fetching on the server. I'm going to start with getting data using the fetch function on the server. And to do so, what we can do is simply we call the function and we specify a URL that will be downloaded. I don't want to explain the entire fetch API because we will have another video about explaining everything under the hood is fetch function. But for now, imagine it accepts the first parameter as the URL, and that's it. I have prepared something. I'm going to copy that instead. It actually brings some data for us. Let me copy it. Here, for example, I'm calling this API, which is an API from Vercel. I already have this open. And if you open it in your browser using GET request, of course, you get an array of items with ID, title, author, etc. Now I'm going to call this API in my application on my, let's say, home page. And after calling this, it returns an object of type response. And then inside this response, we have other methods such as JSON. And since I know the output of this function is of type JSON, actually, of this API is of type JSON, I'm calling the JSON to get the JSON data out of this response. So we can also call it response, and I can call the response.json and put it into the final data that I will receive. Const data equal. Actually, these are like posts, like blog posts, and it's better to call it like this, posts, and then I can simply render them. Let me copy another snippet code that I have prepared. So if I try to do so, if I go back to my page by doing a refresh, I'm getting an error, and the reason is that I have to await it because this JSON will return a promise. So now I have this information, and these are coming from the API, and it consists of different properties. Of course, the type of this JSON is any. As you can see, the posts are any, but we can later try some methods to convert them to a typed object. For example, I can call also ID. Then you can see IDs here. These are totally mock information, mock data, just for demoing purpose. They're good, but in the real world, you can simply call your APIs and get the data, and you can render them on your page. All of these operations are done on the server. It means what you get on the client is totally the output, the final result, and it's not going to run this fetch function on your browser. It's good to know that this fetch function has an option, a second parameter that we can pass, and it's called cache, and you can set different values here. But for now, I'm going to tell you that by default, it's not going to cache it while you are on the development mode. It means that currently we are running the project on the dev. So every time that I open this page, it's going to call this API and get the fresh data. But by setting the different cache values here, you can change this behavior. For example, if I go to force cache, it's going to call it only once. And the output of this fetch is going to be stored at some place in the next folder. I will open it in a second. And from now on, if I try to run it again, it will store the output of this API to that folder, to a file, and later it will only grab the data from that file if it exists. And if it doesn't, it tries to get it and then store it in the file. And later, if someone else maybe opens your page, a new user, they will get the data from that location. So the place that it will store is in the .next. You can go to the cache, then fetch cache, and at some point maybe here, because it was new, maybe this is the one. Let me try to format the code. If I try to format the document, I have to change the language maybe to JSON because it will be stored as JSON. So I can now format it. Yeah, as you can see, it's calling the URL that is stored in this file. is the same one that we are trying to call here. And other information, for example, the body is encoded into base 64. And other information you can see here, maybe revalidation after, I don't know, how much is this, maybe a year or something. And this value indicates after this period of time is going to be expired. And the time that I'm recording at the moment, it is like 1:20 in the morning, but GMT is 16. It is the time that we just stored this information, and after this period of time, it will be stale and expired, and the fetch function is going to call the API again. That was the force cache, but by default, if we don't specify it, it's not going to be this one. It's going to be called on every request. So every time that I open this home page, it's going to download the data, the fresh data from the API. But if you try to build the project, it's going to be downloaded only once. And since it's going to be an static page, because it's not going to be changed, it's not going to call it every time, unless you call or you have some kind of dynamic functions. And if you remember from dynamic functions, we have functions like cookies or like headers. And having these function calls on your page causes this page to be of type dynamic. So every time, it means every time that you have this fetch, it's going to be called even on the production. But for now, we don't have it, so I will expect this to be only called on dev every time, but on production only once at build time. And the other option of this cache, the other value that we can pass is no store. It means it's going to be stored in the memory, not in these files that I mentioned. Every time every user calls this page, it's going to be called once. And if at some other points in the project, I call this again, maybe in another component down in the React tree, I call it again, it's not going to be called or fetched from the source again, because I have stored it in the memory. So this is the meaning of no store. The other way that we can make the page of type dynamic without calling any dynamic functions is by simply exporting a constant on your page called dynamic, and you can set the value to force dynamic. And having this constant on your page is something meaningful. It's a convention from the Next.js, and it interprets it as a dynamic route. So every time you try to get some data to open this page, it's going to call your page over and over. So I don't want to use this as well. I leave it as the default. And now next step, what I can do is to explain how we can make it as a typed value or typed object. Currently, the type of this post is any. So simply I could have this type of maybe post, like type post equal something. It has this ID number, title of type string, and a not very clean way is to just simply cast it like this. It's okay. And now you have this post of type post, an array of posts, and here and these are typed now. But also there's another way that you can use using third-party libraries like Zod, and by using them you can perform also some kind of validation on the returned data from this API. I also have prepared something here to use this Zod. So first of all, what we can do is I have to import Zod, and you have to install it. You call simply npm izod, like this, npm izod. And something that this Zod does is that it tries to run some kind of validations on data. And since these posts are kind of data, we can perform the validation as well as extracting types out of it. So first of all, I import the Zod, and then I can define some kind of schemas here for posts. And this post has this ID, title, and author. And if you are familiar with Zod, the way it works is that I define an object by calling z.object, and then I specify all the properties that this object can have, like ID, which is of type z.number, like this, and title of type z.string, etc. And since this is a single object or singular, I can have another kind of posts schema instead of post schema, which is an array of post schema. So This is an array of this one. And now I can extract a type out of it. So by calling this Zod.infer, I will get this post type. And finally, what I can try to do is using this post schema against this. So I can say post schema dot parse the output of this function. It's not using this post. It's better to extract all these values into a function. Maybe I can create a function like this, const fetch posts, and then it returns a promise of posts, and then I can call it instead like this, const post equal get posts, and I have to await like this. Okay, now this way I could say that the output of this constant function, this constant, which is an arrow function, would be of type post, and now I can use this type of posts. Now maybe it's cleaner, but of course it's better to move entire getting data into another module. Maybe I can open a file here like this, services post service.js or ts, and then I can extract the required codes here. Then I can export this one. Now if I try to import it, it's better now, and we get the same result here. So that was it from the calling fetch function. But at some points you might get data from other sources, which is not available by calling the fetch. For example, you might have a database and you want to get data from the database, and you want to pass this data from the database throughout different components on the server. And still we are talking about the server. For example, here I have made a function or let's say file called db, which is a simple database-like object. It is a function that has some static users and has this function that will return one of these users based on the given ID. And I have simulated a timeout to make some delay, so end users will see this 200 delay, just to make it like a real world problem. And I'm going to call this instead. We assume that we are getting this data from a database maybe. Now let me call this one instead. So if I import db from this path, and it's a function, then I can select this one like this, select user by ID 1, and then I can return it, const user ID. Now I can get rid of this one as well. All right, so let's render it somewhere. I say something like this because user can be null, and actually I have to await it again. And now it's working fine. I'm getting this user John, and if I pass 2, you can see another user. All right, that's fine. But something that is going on here is that it's taking 200 milliseconds based on this timeout that I put here. Maybe I'm calling this function on different pages or different places in my project or on my page. For example, I could have done this here as well as something that I'm doing on the home page. What we want to do is we want to cache it. We are sure that it's not going to be changed. So it's better to cache it, but for how long? And the answer is until the request response pipeline is not done. So what does it mean? When I try to open the page, I send a request to the server, and it tries to produce some output, and still I'm in the pipeline. I have sent request to the server, haven't received any response. Still I'm in the pipeline. The pipeline is not done. During this period, if I call this function over and over in different places, I want to cache it somehow. For example, imagine I might have a component here, like list.tsx, and let's export something. I fast forward. And as you can see, I'm calling this again. And I'm going to maybe render it on my page, on my home page, like this. Well, actually I could have done this by passing this user to this component like this. But imagine it's at some point in the React tree that I don't want to drill down the props. And I cannot use context providers here. It's on the server, right? If I call this data getting data, or this query from the database, let's call it, twice in different places or multiple times within the same request pipeline. One is at the page level and another is at some component level. But here's the problem. It will take 200 milliseconds each based on this value here. And if you're calling a database, real database, and it takes like, I don't know, 500 milliseconds or 550 milliseconds, doesn't matter. Every time it will send the request to the database. And to prevent this, what we can do, of course, we can cache it simply. So to do so, I simply wrap this function with cache. And this cache actually comes from the React. It's not something that Next.js guys have implemented. I import it from the React, and that's it. I could memoize this function, and it is different from the use memo or memo function from React. First of all, it only can be run on the server. If I wanted to use memo, this DB should be of type a React hook or a component. But since it is not, I have to use this cache. And about memo, actually the memo function from the React is supposed to wrap around components. So it is not of type component. So the only option that I could use is the cache function, which is recommended by Next.js as well. But here's a small problem. Every time that I call this function, I'm creating a new instance of this cache. For example, here I am calling this DB once, and here another time. And I'm generating this object twice. So this cache will point to different places in the memory. It's not going to work. What I can do, simply I can convert this DB of type a function to a simple object like this. And then I could move them out like this. And then instead of returning something, I can have these properties all in the object. So this property is going to be of type a method in this object. Now I can get rid of this function call invocation here and here. Now it's going to work as expected. And to prove it, we can try to console log something here. Let's call it console log cache called. And if I open the console log, I should only see one. So let's refresh. And as you can see, I can only see one time cache here. But if we don't use this cache, let's see what happens. Immediately, I will call this function twice because of not using cache. Now the question is, what if I want to perform two or more than one async task and fetch some data on the server? But because of the nature of JavaScript, which is single thread, I can just at the moment perform one task. But if I try to await and try to call different services or different async tasks, one at a time would be run. But there's a solution for that, and this can affect the performance. Let me explain the code. For example, if I try to get some data from the database, this mock database, I call this one and I have to await. And then after this, I want to call this post service like this, post service, but inside it, I have another object. Yeah, fetch posts. I call this one and I await. Then I try to return something. If this one takes, I don't know, a couple of seconds, and this one as well, the problem is here that I'm calling them sequentially. But if I want to run them in parallel, there's a pattern that we can perform them. And to do so, I can return, since that they are returning a promise, I can get them in and put them inside a constant. For example, let's say const user by user query, for example. I can say promise like this. And for this one as well, I can put the result of this fetch post. Instead of awaiting, put the object, the promise object inside the constant, like post promise or post task, I could say task like this. Can make more sense. And then at the end, I can perform a promise.all, which is a function from the promise object. And then I can, as you can see, it's suggesting this code for me. I can continue and I can pass an array of all the promises that I have. And this is going to run them in parallel for me. And then I can await here. This way I can run this one and this one at the same time and wait for the result. Later I can get the result here in an array because I'm sending an array. The first array would be the user info, for example here, user info, I can say, or whatever you want, maybe user is fine. And the next one is posts, something like this. And then I can consume these two data here. If I take a look, you can see the type of this user is ID name, and the post is an array of ID title author. Let's try to render them. Return, for example, if I return a fragment, yeah, I trust this one again, and let's see what would happen here. As you can see, I see welcome John because of this ID. If I change it to welcome Jane, and then I see the list of users. This is a common pattern that can boost the performance for you. I highly recommend, if you have multiple async tasks on your server, go with this solution, with this promise.all, to have a better performance and a load time because of the running tasks in parallel. And finally, the last part that I want to explain is how to get data from the client. So far, whatever we have done was on the server. For example, these are going to be run on the server, and we are in the server. But if we have a client-side component and perform these kind of actions, it's going to be a server action. I haven't talked about server actions so far. I'm going to cover them in the future. And it's going to work, but it's not recommended way of fetching data. We can perform data mutation by importing something like this in my client-side component, but for fetching data, it's not the recommended way. The recommended way is to call an API directly using the fetch, for example, this fetch function on the client, but not in this way. I'm going to explain how. And also you can, instead of fetch, you can also use third-party libraries like Axios that under the hood is going to use this fetch anyway. But let's try and see how it works. So I get rid of everything here, and I try to, in my home page, I try to render a component. Let's say I have this list component, return list, and this list is going to take care of everything. And I make this list as a client-side component, use client. And this way I can write some codes like use effect. I know this is not the best solution. First of all, don't mention me in the comments. I'm going to improve and give you another better solution instead of using use effect. But there's this convenient and easy way, but not recommended, by using use effect. So let's import it from the React. I think we have a problem here in my TypeScript. Let me restart the TypeScript again. Now, if I try, no, I can, yeah, I have it. Oh, my mistake. So, and what I'm getting is that the list component cannot be, client component cannot be async. So I get rid of this one as well. And I can keep this data for now. Okay, in this use effect, I can directly call a fetch function like before. I have this, I used to have a URL pointing to this API. But since this code is going to be run on the client, I don't think so. They have opened, they allow us to call from another domain. We will get a cross-domain, cross-origin error. But let's try it and see if I receive it. So if I refresh, probably I see the problem. Let's see in the comments, in the console. So let me attach it, maybe detach it somewhere like here. If I go to the network, if I refresh, yeah, at this point I get the CORS error, which is a security thing that a browser gives us, and the idea is to not let an application make calls to other domains, and actually the other domain is preventing to be invoked from another domain. So API.versal is not allowing me to call their API from my domain, which is currently localhost. To fix it, we can make an API by ourselves in our application. And if you remember to do so, what we could do is to make a folder and a file called route. So I make maybe a folder here called, I call it API, then I create a file called route, and here I simply export a constant called get, export, or a function called get default async function, async function get uppercase. And actually I have to return a next response. Return a next response like this, then a JSON. It sounds better now. I can copy these users from here, put it here, and get rid of this. Let's refresh. Instead, I'm getting the error, and the reason can be I should not make it default. Probably I have to restart the server because it's maybe cached. Now I get the data, as you can see, and now since it is on the same origin, I can call it from the browser. Let's call it now. If I make a call here to API and simply API, and then I can get the data const response equal the fetch, equal fetch, and then I have to await it. And since the type of this callback to use effect is not async, I cannot make it async. I have to wrap and make an async function. Async function like this, fetch data, and then I move the code here, and then I can call the fetch data, and now it should work. Then I have to await this response and get the actual data, maybe users. I call it users. And now that I have these users, I can set it to an state. Let's create an state, const users and set users. Should be of type user state, not of type, but I have to call this user state, and I have to import it. Now here I can simply get the data and set it directly to the user state, set users like this, and I have to await it. Now this way I get the data and read the data, convert it to JSON and put it into the state. At this point, it will render, since I have changed the state, it will re-render my component, and inside the re-render I can consume that here maybe. So I copy this code, and let's see what happens if I try. I can get rid of this fragment to not have that error. Let's see if I try to refresh. I go to the home page, and I get this error because probably on my route I'm not sending. Yeah, okay, it has this users object. I can get rid of it and directly return the object instead. Now it sounds better. Let me refresh. Now it's working fine, and it has name age. I can use this maybe name and age here instead of, because my data consists of these types. Now, as you can see, in the client side, I'm getting the data in the use effect. And this is not the best way because I'm not covering the error handling here. And to do so, I have to make some try catch and write some try catches. That makes the code a little bit dirty, and I have to also handle, it's better to handle loading as well to show a loading indicator. So it means that I have to write a lot of logics here to handle these kind of scenarios. But there are other options. That's something which is also recommended by Next.js by using third-party libraries. So the one that is recommended here is the SWR. You have to install it. I think I have installed it already. Let me take a look. No, actually I haven't, but I can install it. It's easy. So let me stop npmi SWR. And if you're curious, I'm talking about this package. So you can take a look later to this domain. Let me zoom. swr.vercel.app, and it is a npm package. You can install it, and the way it works is you simply import it here, and you make a call to the API through a fetcher. This fetcher, under the hood, you have to make it and simply call the API in that function. Let's try it first. I will install it now. If I go back and npm install SWR, yep, and it's installed now. Now I can use it here. By the way, it's better to write these kind of data fetching logics inside other places, not inside your component. But for now, let's keep it here. I can always do the refactoring. And as you can see, I can copy this code instead of writing them to save some time. Then I have to import this one as well. I don't need the use effect anymore because you're not going to use it anyway. Now if I call this API and the way it works, as you can see, the first parameter is the API route, and the feature we have to implement it, and the way that we usually implement. Let me see if the Copilot will complete it. Otherwise, I have to write it const feature. Yeah, this is the way it works. So the fetcher is a function that receives a URL and we'll call the fetch. And this fetch is the simple fetch API that we have in the browser. And then we'll wait and return the response in JSON for us. I have to make it a string to get rid of this error, like this. And then it should work now. But the interesting thing is that, as you can see, this use SWR is a React hook, and it returns some kind of objects. As you can see, it consists of data, error, and is loading. So if I calling this API, I get any kind of error like 500 or 400, the error would be populated. And if I get the error, I return an error to the end users. If the page is loading or this API is calling, it might take, I don't know, seconds or milliseconds. I can show a loading here by writing this kind of logics. And eventually, if I have the data and there's no error and loading, I can safely say that, okay, I have the data to show to the end users. I can go with the latest and last scenario. So I can get the data and maybe convert it to, rename it to users. And now it should work as expected. Let me run the project again, npm run dev. Okay, let me refresh. As you can see, it's working fine as expected, and you see a loading. It goes quickly, but if I make it a little bit, maybe wait, you promise 1 second. If I make it slower for a second, you might see this loading for a second. Then we get the data. This is a recommended way, a better way at least, to fetch data on the client. Of course, you can wrap them and move them to, as I said, other functions, other services. There are patterns like clean architect that tries to split the logics into different layers. For example, this data fetching can be done in the services, then service can pass this data to another layer to make an object a presentable object that can be consumed on the client directly. It can clean up and get rid of some redundant information that we might receive from the server. And then you can use a clean and get a cleaned, ready to use data or information on your component that you can directly consume it. But for now, I will keep it simple like this. And I think we are done. And I hope you get the idea how you can get data and by calling fetch on the server or on the client, and how to use cache function from React on the server to improve the performance and not making duplicate calls to the data sources. See you in the next ones.